Okay. Is all the lighting good? Can you see, or would you like more light?
I can see you great.
Perfect. Well, how do we start this off? I have not yet had anyone who I would describe as outside what you might call the counter-woke movement, or not even somebody who is woke, but just outside of that kind of space of James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, John McWhorter, Chris Rufo, who else would be in that space? Wilfred Riley, that kind of sphere of people. Even somebody like Greg Lukianoff from FIRE, kind of anyone who's further maybe outside of that. I mean, John McWhorter may be the furthest, or Bill Maher might be the furthest to the left, who has said that they want to have a conversation. Most of the time, people think, and I think this is something about social media, that having a conversation of that nature in front of people and in public holds too much of an opportunity to have a flank exposed, to have a weak point shown to the world. And I understand that view entirely, and I have some sympathy with that view, quite frankly. But my kind of idea is that I'm sure I have weak points. I can't possibly not have any weak points. I'm not omnipotent, nor nearly brilliant enough to have avoided that. So if I have some weak points or things I haven't thought about exposed today, well, that's the price of learning, isn't it? So.
Yeah, when you say they haven't spoken outside of that, do you mean like people that you consider? You're saying people that you consider broadly on the political left don't want to have those conversations? Is that what you mean?
No, what I mean is that it hasn't been possible for somebody who is even a consistent liberal like Helen Pluckrose, who is consistently on the side of being counter woke, to have a conversation with somebody who thinks that the counter woke movement broadly, so that would include even liberals like Kathy Young and Claire Lehman at Quillette and those kinds of people. There hasn't really been a chance for somebody who is either woke or woke sympathetic or clearly outside the counter woke movement, but on the left. So somebody who might not be woke but would be sympathetic in that direction and is definitely not counter woke might be Jason Stanley from Yale. Right?
Okay, yeah, I'm familiar with some of these names. I see them pop up occasionally. I am certainly someone who, and we'll get into this in the conversation, I hate the terms woke and anti-woke. I hate CRT as a term. I'm a big believer in avoiding overarching generalizations and focusing as much as possible on specific concrete issues. That said, I understand the utility of labels, like Christian, for example. Maybe we can get into this later. So I am loath to call myself woke, but certainly I am relatively left when it comes to the political policies that I would endorse. And I think that I'm sympathetic to many of the issues and buzzwords that are traditionally associated with wokeness, or whatever terms people are using to kind of create a monolith out of what are, in my opinion, a variety of separate issues. But yeah, happy to be here. I think it's really important for people to have these conversations. So I appreciate your talking with me.
Yeah. So I guess the way to start this, and I'm not sure exactly how to go, but that's a nice introduction. Actually, that's a good point off the point about labeling is what are we doing when we're labeling and why? What is the to use a postmodern term phrase, what is the point of socially reifying our ontological categories? Why? What is it that we're after? Because there's lots of uses for labeling, and there's also lots of uses for not wanting to be labeled. Part of one of the reasons you might want to label something is so that you can get a good grasp of what you're talking about without having to re-describe it every single time. And for example, if we're talking about something like nuclear fusion, it might be good to have a concept like nuclear fusion so we don't need to re-describe our entire understanding of the atom every time we want to mention it.
You bet.
A good reason a reason that somebody might want to avoid being labeled is because they would want to hide their political and social affiliations in some way, for reasons that might be good or might be bad. For example, somebody in a totalitarian dictatorship might not want to ascribe themselves the word liberal because that might not go so well. So wanting to not be labeled can be both good and bad, and labeling can be both good and bad. So
it's not about not wanting to be labeled. I mean, I'll give you an example from my last book, which was on the topic of what's natural. And so I looked at the idea of naturalness in a whole host of areas, and I really there are some serious problems with that term. And the problem with it is not that some totalitarian government is going to come for you if you're eating natural food. The problem is that it makes conversations about a range of topics, whether it's nuclear energy or organic farming or, contraception. I mean, it's an endless list of things. When the word natural comes in, what it does is it flattens a lot of really important nuance. And it makes it seem as if there is something common to, for example, I don't know, using a condom and genetically engineering a plant. They're both unnatural. I mean, I guess sure, as so far as it goes, that's like an accurate. I mean, you have to go read my book, an accurate description. But I think it's pretty useless when it comes to us talking about whether or not we want to use condoms or genetically modify plants. And so for me, the key question is, why do we label something, and is it useful for what it is that we want to accomplish concretely? And I should state at the outset, what I want to accomplish concretely is I want to get as many people together talking about pressing issues that face us when it comes to everything from reforming education to addressing environmental conservation, climate change. These are really tough questions. I want to get as many smart people as I can working together with their collective knowledge and perspectives to make things better. And the basic essence of my argument, or the position I have at least with wokeness and anti-wokeness and CRT and anti-CRT, is that we're caught in an outrage machine that is creating divisiveness and escalating political conflict through a series of binaries that we've seen in the past with things like pro-life and pro-choice, which also flattens a very complicated issue. And so I guess the side I am on is the side of, I think the woke, anti-woke binary is a product of an outrage machine that's escalating political conflict and flattening complicated issues. And I am in favor of backing away from that, de-escalating the political conflict, and separating out all of the issues that are getting lumped in under wokeness, anti-wokeness, CRT, anti-CRT, whatever it is. So that's the position I'd like to take. And I'm happy to have a conversation about that and sort of the specifics of why I feel so strongly that we need to de-escalate what is, I think, a kind of addiction to outrage, and get closer to constructive dialogue about issues where there's a lot of reasonable disagreement. I think if we get away from the mudslinging and the slurs.
So I agree with your view insofar as I appreciate it. My how would I put this? So I think that I would like to take what you just did, and I'd like to split off two things. I think that the outrage machine is an interesting conversation to have. I think that's probably right. I think that the advent of social media and cable news means, on the one hand, you have cable news flooding us with various information from various perspectives, tons of opinion, right? And social media, the coin of the realm is attention, and outrage really monetizes it. And if you put those two things together, and there's a whole lot more that I've missed, but if you put at least those two things together, you get a pretty potent set of incentives to produce outrage, and the production of outrage on that scale gives you a feedback loop that really is self-reinforcing. So yes,
absolutely. And I
I
want
think
to
that's
I want to pause you there because I don't want to blame modernity, or like the age of social media. We also just like labels. We like to know who us is and who
right.
them is. And historically, in my opinion, that's often ended up in bad places. So another thing that I
Yeah,
think social media is building on is this sort of attraction to binaries, right? These are the bad guys, these are the good guys, this is the bad perspective, this is the good perspective. So yeah, so I just to second what you're
yeah,
saying, but also to say that this is exploiting a very human tendency that's been around forever, and one that
yes,
freaks me out a little, and that I want to, as much as I can, gently push back on for the sake of
yeah,
having communities that aren't divided up into us and them. Yeah, but absolutely,
yeah.
I'm totally with you on the social media stuff.
So I agree, and I think um, I think that's right. I think it's these they exploit our natural human tendencies. Um, they exploit part of our intellectual and social architecture.
Yeah,
There's a, or maybe not exploit is not the right word, but our intellectual and social architecture is definitely synergistic in the phenomenon with that.
yeah.
I would agree. So when it comes to the woke, anti-woke aspect of it, um, I don't think, I want to be careful with what I do. So this is in some ways similar to the liberal conservative split of the 60s through maybe the 90s, in that you have two groups fighting over a social vision, or something like a social vision, or something like a social politics. But I think woke, anti-woke, I think if we get clear about what we mean by what we're actually talking about when we say woke, so that we can decouple some of the issues which are thought of as being attached to woke, and if we can decouple those, and then get our finger around what it is that most of us who are anti-woke actually take issue with, and this would encompass everyone from James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian to Chris Rufo to myself,
Sure.
all the way over to somebody like John McWhorter or Kathy Young. If you were, and Jesse Singal, that kind of
Yeah. Let's focus.
constellation.
I mean, not to like push back. I know a lot of people who are watching this or who will watch this are going to know those names, but I'd like a lot of people to watch this, and for the sake of catholicity of audience, like
Yeah,
it would be really helpful, I think, to focus on specific issues, which you're about to do, because I think a lot of people,
okay.
who are not extremely online like you and me, might
Yeah,
not know who all these people are.
that's,
I
yeah.
would love to have a conversation that's useful to a super wide audience.
Okay. So what I will do is I will say the nub of the issue, if you take all those personalities that people may know or may not know and you
Yeah.
remove them and you clear that playing field, the fundamental thing which everyone who is counter woke is opposed to is a, we'll call it a worldview, which is composed in large part of the alloy of critical theory and postmodernism. Now, we just said we want to make this as wide as possible, and then I used some jargon. So let me unpack some of that a little bit. The suggestion is that if we were to take some of the common themes that we see coming out of what gets pointed at as that's woke, it's a lot of systems of power, biases, institutional racism, sexism, misogyny, structural issues, and a lot of that comes across as quite jargony in some ways. So I'd like to get a little bit of a handle on kind of what that means, and then I can explain where kind of our objection is. We can then go and maybe see where that conflict is.
Sure.
And if that's possible, maybe there are some things in which we can set aside and decouple from that entire debate and work on those things.
Absolutely. What I'm going to hope to do also for the, I mean, jargon is great. You know, I've got a PhD in religion. I do a ton of philosophy. I think this would be really helpful. So, for example, with a term, and to let you go on the wokeness, but with a term like identity politics, for example, what I think is really helpful is to give concrete examples. So, for example, does the identity of a scientist matter when it comes to evaluating the results of a study, right? And then that helps us really kind of, you know, ground ourselves in an issue. So, or postmodernism, right? Is science subjective or objective? Well, let's look at a specific case and talk about it in a way that people can really grab onto. So I'm looking forward to taking the jargon that you're going to lay out, not jargon, because that's sort of pejorative, but the conceptual apparatus that you're going to lay out, and then really tie it down to some clear, easy to understand examples.
So why don't I put this into a little bit of a story form, and we can apply it to a concrete example, which is me.
Great.
And then we'll go. So when I got my first degree. This is a book called A Primer on Postmodernism. I just realized it will be backwards in the.
No, it's forwards to me. The people on the other side, I can read it perfectly.
Okay, so A Primer on Postmodernism by Stanley Grenz. That was a book that was assigned to me when I was getting my first degree in theology, actually. And I went, give me just 1 second here. I want to do something because it's getting. Where I'm at, it's getting, we're having a bit of a heat wave, so it's the lights in here are starting to make the room cook.
You do whatever you like, and if you want, I don't know how you do your videos, feel free to edit it however you want, as long as the edits are generous.
Oh, we're editing. We're editing for absolutely for generosity. I might just leave that stuff in just so everyone knows that it's all on the up and up.
Perfect. I got the sense we're on the same page, but it's always good to make sure.
Yeah. I don't.
There's a bipartisan problem with shitty editing, and I think we both agree that it is no good.
I have no interest in trying to.
I didn't get that sense. Yeah. So go on. I'm sorry. I keep interrupting you.
No, that's okay. And when I was there was a nascent kind of movement that had popped up in Protestant Christian circles called the Emergent Church. And the Emergent Church phenomenon kind of popped up, I would say, in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. And what distinguished it is that it kicked off a conversation about postmodernism. And at that time, the way that the Protestant Christians, and my denomination was Protestant Evangelical Charismatic Pentecostals. My family is Jewish. I come from a Jewish family. My family converted when my mom and dad converted to Pentecostalism. Before I was born into it, so I would go back and forth between my Jewish family and my Pentecostal church. And having gone to university, let me just say with as much love in my heart as I possibly can, my people are not academics. That is not how Pentecostalism moves forward. It's more experiential. And the people are not dumb. There's lots of people who have.
I'm very familiar with charismatic Christian movements.
Okay, good. It's more I don't want to throw those people under the bus anyway. But their theology is not known for its being technical. But they did have one fairly good theologian. We had one fairly good theologian named Stanley Grenz, who was associated with us named Stanley Grenz, and he wrote this book, A Primer on Postmodernism, and his essential contention was that we are experiencing a shift from the Enlightenment modern age, and we're shifting now into a postmodern age. And this was completely misunderstood for 20 years. Everyone got said, oh, so what you're talking about is your truth is more truth and my truth is my truth and everything is relative. That is the lowest possible resolution understanding we could have had that still is even in gesturing in the direction of correct. It is far more complicated and nuanced and careful than that, but that wasn't entirely seen. And by the time 2007, 2008, 2009 rolled around, most of the people, at least in my denomination, said, yeah, that's coming to an end. That was a fad. And they thought this because, in large part, they didn't understand what postmodernism was. They understood the version that they got from the pastor, who got it from talking with the other theologians, who read it from friends, who got it from. And so there's this degrading, and it's like taking an HD video and moving it down to 140p, right? We're this isn't HD anymore. This is 8-bit Nintendo that we're getting. So that was my intro to postmodernism. And I then went to university and I studied philosophy. And I said, well, society is heavily influenced by postmodernism. And they said, no, postmodernism, that died out in the 80s. And I said, no. Oh, no. I said, head down to anthropology, head down to women's studies, head down to queer theory, head down to the law schools and critical race theory, and you will find that postmodernism has still, English departments in particular, postmodern theories of interpretation and of language and of art are common. So there's a bit of or more than a bit, there's a lot of a fight in and around what postmodernism is, and it's really misunderstood, I think. So I'd like to give, as much as I can, as quickly as I can, a bit of an explanation about what postmodernism says, and then we'll talk about how that blended with critical theory and how that forms, I think, something like a coherent worldview.
Okay.
And the coherent worldview has been brought forward and is now formed the basis of what gets pointed at and called woke.
Sounds great.
Okay. So first we're going to talk about Derrida. And I think Derrida is probably the thinker that gets misunderstood the most by everyone. People think, well, Derrida just said language didn't mean anything. No. Or they'll say, well, Derrida was just reminding us that there's different ways of interpreting things. Also, no. This is wrong. For the people who are watching who have no intro to Derrida at all, let me just say that unpacking his entire philosophy, if me and Alan were to go the entire night, would still not be possible, because Derrida wrote like 40 books. So we're going to unpack the most important, salient idea with the caveat that there's a lot more to read. Let's do that. So Derrida did something that's actually kind of common in philosophy, and that's to say, hey, there's this phenomenon that we haven't been paying any attention to, or haven't been paying close attention to. And if we really pay attention to this phenomenon, we make some very important discoveries about things, ideas, concepts that we've missed that we need to incorporate into our larger field of study. And what Derrida focused on was this obscure thing called writing. Now, prior to Derrida, so the story goes, so Derrida says, look, you guys have always thought of writing as just the inscribing of words. It is the graphic form, the picture form of the real language, which is the spoken thing. He says, look, language is the spoken. You guys all think that language is the spoken thing. And writing is just the symbolized version of the spoken thing. So we'll take, for example, the word tree. The word tree is when I say tree. That T-R-E-E thing that's carved into the stone, or that's put on the tablet, or that's typed on the screen, that is a derivative form of the actual word. He goes, and you guys generally think, says Derrida, or so the story goes, that words are like names or labels that we stick onto reality. And Derrida says, you all thought that out there, and there's a form or a concept of a tree, and then there's a physical tree, and then I see the tree and have a representation. Then I turn around and say the word tree to somebody who writes it down. That's a maybe a Lockean view, what we'll call that. That might be something that John Locke might have said. And then, says Derrida, along came Ferdinand de Saussure. And Ferdinand de Saussure says, no, you guys have got it wrong. What's actually happening is that there's the concept, what he might call the signified, and then there's the symbol, what we might call, the signifier. And he says, look, what you do is you take those two things together, the word and the concept, you glue those two things together, and that creates a sign, so that when you see the sign, you go, okay, I know what that means, you can go out and look for it. So the idea here is you take the concept of a tree, and you attach that to the word tree, which is the thing I say, tree, or the symbol tree. You take that phonic sound tree, and you glue that to a concept, and lo and behold, you get a sign. And then when someone says tree, and you know what it means, you can go out and find one. Now Derrida is going to come along and say, you guys have made a mistake here. Derrida is going to say, look, you guys think that speech is better than writing, because when you're writing, you write the word tree down. But that's just the derivative form of the spoken word tree. And it's the spoken word tree that's attached to the meaning. The written word tree only isn't attached to the meaning. The written word tree is just a symbol of the spoken word tree. And when somebody is speaking, you have their live, present intentions. You have their attention. You have them right there with you. Their meaning is right in front of you. Like when you and I talk right now, you could stop me and ask me questions. My intentions, my attention, my meaning is right here with us in this conversation. Whereas if you were reading a book and I said something confusing, you'd be stuck.
Or watching a recording of spoken words, which is interesting too. That's an aside, though, for modern semiotic theory of video recordings. At any rate, go on. I'm curious to hear how this all hooks up to CRT and why it is good to use the labels woke and anti-woke.
Yes, and we're going to get right to that, because as soon as we get through Derrida, we're going to have our postmodern worldview. We're going to hit that critical theory and then talk about how that gets into CRT. So we're going to have this little slow section to start, which I apologize to all the viewers for. So Derrida says, look, we've got, you guys thought, all you people think, that speech is up here and writing is this derivative form down here. And Derrida's going to come along and say, all of your explanations are wrong. This is all incorrect. There's no concept of tree that gets attached to the spoken word tree that gets symbolized by the word tree and refers out there to trees in the world. He goes, no, this is wrong. This is a bad theory of language. The Saussurians are going to get mad at me for not saying sound image, so I'll say it there just so they know. And Derrida's going to say something, this is all wrong. Derrida's going to say, look, if you want to know what a tree is, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to do one of two things. You're going to ask someone what it means, or you're going to look in the dictionary. Suppose you look in the dictionary. What do you find? You find more words. You don't find some meaning or a concept. You find more words. Now, suppose you want to look up those words. What are you going to do? Are you going to look up the word? Say, suppose you look at
has Derrida never seen a children's dictionary in this scenario? Because the kids' dictionaries have useful pictures of trees next to the definition. I'm kidding around. I'm very familiar with this whole gloss, but I think people will understand. So I like the idea of a dictionary without words, which is how most of them were for a while.
Yeah, and Derrida's going to say, look, you find more words. Oh, and then if you look up those words, you find more words. And Derrida's going to say, look, there's not some mythical concept floating around that gets attached to the words. Derrida says what's really going on is that the words are just defined by other words. And those words are defined by other words. All words are just defined endlessly by other words. And what he thinks is they don't get their meanings by being glued to some concept. He thinks they get their meaning by the way that they relate to other words. He says, look, if you get enough words together and you see how they relate to each other, the meaning just kind of emerges like a specter or a mist. That's what he thinks. He says, look, you guys think that there's these concepts that are these mysterious conceptual entities and dictionary definitional entities that are hovering about the universe that get glued to phonic signifiers, to sounds, to words that are spoken. Derrida goes, no, no, no. What's happening is that words are defined by other words and they all just float around. And so Derrida says, well, remember you said that a written word is just a symbol of the spoken word. And Derrida goes, yeah, that's how everything is. Spoken words are just referring to other spoken words, which just refer to other spoken words. It's all just words referring to words.
Can I pause you, because I'm not a scholar of Derrida. This is an aside, totally useless for the conversation, but I'm just fascinated. What does he do with like exclamations of pain, like "ow"? Do you know anything about that? That's just an aside. I'll set that aside for myself to research later. So in other words, that's a word, but it also emerges clearly out of if you punch someone in the stomach, right? And they go oof. The word oof, it seems like emerges out of the thing that you do not biologically when someone punches you in the stomach. I'm just curious, like there must be some words that are obviously, or onomatopoeia. Like what does he do with like onomatopoeia?
And the answer to that is actually the very next thing I'm going to talk about.
Oh, okay.
He's actually going to answer exactly this. Derrida's going to say, look, he says, all words get their meaning by relating to other words. Everything.
Okay.
That's it. That's how the words relate. So I can recognize the word tree in two ways. One is that it's not the word free or bleed or goat. It sounds different. That tree, the phonics sounds different. And it relates to words differently. The word tree has a different relation to branch and paper and leaf than, say, the word television set does. So Derrida says, look, that's what secures the sign's identity. How do you secure the identity of the word tree? Well, by how it sounds and relating to other words, and how it relates to other words within the system of language, right? There is no external concept floating around in the world.
We got to get to white supremacy in the schools. So we got.
So here we go. So Derrida's going to say everything is like that. How do you know what a car is? Well, because it's not a truck, and because it's not a skateboard, and because of the way it relates to the road. All of reality has no essences. There's no substances. There's nothing, just like there's no concept that's floating around that defines the word, there's nothing in the car which defines it as a car. There's nothing in the car that defines it. It's just defined by relationally. So that worldview goes out endlessly. And what it does is it gets rid of anything like an essence, anything like a substance. Derrida actually says in his book, he says, look, all of Western philosophy is an attempt to find an essence, a substance, a God, a definition, existence, something which is there. So the answer to your thing is, ow. Well, where does that get its meaning from? Well, from the way it relates to things like punches in the stomach, and the way it relates to things like not being punched in the stomach, and the way that it relates to other words. Because as Derrida says, that words also, he breaks down, we could say deconstructs, the binary between words in the world.
So how does this hook up with critical race theory?
Okay, so we just have one more thing to get to, then we'll touch on critical theory, and then we'll see how that works. Okay. So what Derrida says is, look, all of Western philosophy is held captive by the idea that we need substances, that we need essences, that there needs to be a center. There needs to be that every object, that this cup, that there's something inherent to the idea of the cup that gives this its cupness and defines it as a cup. And Derrida says what we need to do is stop thinking of it as though we're looking for something that's present in the world and start reading the world as things relationally relate to each other in a system of how they differentiate from each other. There's your postmodern worldview. Okay? There is nothing inherent. It's radical anti-essentialism. So that becomes your postmodern view of the world. So the world, reality in general, can be cut up and read in any different ways. Now, just to defend Derrida, just one thing real quick, is Derrida wouldn't have said you could read the world any way you want. He would have said that the reading and interpretation of the world is endlessly open. It's always what he would say is open to the other. Okay, so now let's connect that. So that is the first shot against what we would call modernism. Because modernists thought that you could have objectively true descriptions of the world that were stable and endless. Derrida's going to say, no, we're always reading and reinterpreting the world. So, when Derrida says we're deconstructing, what he does is he splits it up into two parts. One is we're genealogically going back and figuring out how our concepts were formed. And then we have to undo all of those ideas like essences and God and all the rest of it that are holding our concepts together, because that's all wrong, and we have to start reading. That led through the 80s. What ended up happening with that is, as much as Derrida himself tried to be a really careful thinker, that idea got picked up and everything got endlessly deconstructed into nihilism in the 80s. It was playful deconstruction all the way down. And it turned out that it's almost impossible to build anything with that philosophy, because anything that you build just gets deconstructed. Just gets shown to be just one particular application of power that you're building that we could deconstruct down and say, it's not really correct what you're saying, that's just you imposing your will on the world. It's not, there's my liberalism, my science, my idea of truth isn't in the world, that's just in my own head. That's just linguistic, okay. So that, we're going to put a pin in that. And we're going to say that that's a really good solvent. That can be used to that worldview can be used to deconstruct everything, including itself. And Derrida was very big on self-reflections and deconstructing and making sure that we're always endlessly doing that, right? Lest deconstruction become just a mere slogan. So now we're going to bring in something like critical theory. And critical theory is going to say, we're going to look where traditional theory would have been something like trying to get an objective scientific view of the world, objective description. Critical theory has a normative basis to it. And critical theory says we want to understand and criticize society in a way that we remove all oppression. That's a really rough definition. But I'm aware as the conversation ages that we could talk endlessly about this. So critical theory says we're going to theorize about sociology, anthropology, and religion, and we're going to theorize those things in a way so as to understand how oppression functions, and we're going to try and get rid of the oppression, and we're going to not concern ourselves. We are going to, as critical theorists, take what is and say, yeah, it might be this way, but we're going to talk about how it should be. It's a normative ethical commitment. So how do those things, what does that have to do with Robin DiAngelo getting taught in kindergarten? Okay. So to cut it down to critical race theory, when critical race theory was being put together, and you could trace the start of it to 1973, when Derek Bell wrote Race, Racism, and American Law, that might be where the seed was planted, but it really didn't take off until the social movement picked up in 1981 when Derek Bell left Harvard, and it was picked up by Kimberly Crenshaw. And it didn't really become its own discipline until 1987, when Kimberly Crenshaw put out a call for papers, new developments in critical race theory, and she talks about this in a panel where she says there were no old developments in critical race theory, it was new. And critical race theory wanted to take up, it wanted to criticize the workings of American law through the lens of race, but it used interdisciplinary tools from everything from Marxist analysis to postmodern analysis to critical theoretical analysis, structuralist analysis, any analysis it could. And so it would pull from different critical race theorists who were all kind of in this would pull from various traditions, everything from what was called critical legal studies to Marxism to post-structuralism. All these isms, these disparate academic fields all got pulled in. And one of the things that was brought in was a postmodern view of the law. The other thing that got pulled in was critical theory. And I believe it was Angela Harris in 1991 said what they wanted to do was use postmodernism, that Derridian idea that we can deconstruct all the ideas and say that's not inherent, that's just you imposing yourself on the world. We're going to use that to deconstruct the liberal conception of the law. And the liberal's going to say, look, we have Enlightenment reason, we have the reasonable person standard, we have objectivity and neutrality, and postmodernism is going to say, no, you don't. Your idea of a reasonable person is a Western created construct, and we can deconstruct it down to find out all the assumptions and presuppositions that are built into it, which delegitimize it. And then we're going to use critical theory to build and have a new view of law. And when you put those two things together, that critical theoretical lens, which says we're going to view everything, we're going to view culture and hegemony and oppression as the main thing to be fought, and that postmodern view of the world, and you fuse those two things together, you get a view of the world where all of the traditional categories of knowledge, science, reason, rationality, objective truth, all of those categories cease to be absolute descriptions of the world and instead become sociologically contingent terms that need to be deconstructed. Okay? Critical race theory, queer theory, certain elements of anthropology, post-colonial theory are all built on the basis of the worldview which mixes critical theory and postmodernism together. That's my contention. And my contention is that there are more than two problems with it, but two basic problems with it. One is that it's infinitely unstable, and it's endlessly fragmentary, so it can't be built upon. And second is that it is at its heart nihilistic and cynical. Because nothing can ever be built, the only explanation that can be given for why a thing is the way it is to look at group interests. So even something like science, which is supposed to give us, as much as is possible, a stable and clear view of the world, the scientific method gets deconstructed down and viewed as a method that is created by a society that is white supremacist, and therefore white supremacy, bias, homophobia is all baked into not just the institutions of science, which might favor where people can make biased judgments, but into the conceptual apparatus of science itself. The very thought that you could have an objective view of the world is thought itself to contain within it the seeds of racism and bias on this view. That is the thing which I think is a problem. Now, this is where we kind of get into that woke, anti-woke problem. Because what ends up happening is that the people who were doing that were, I think in some way, genuinely concerned about racism. I don't think that Derek Bell was or Kimberly Crenshaw was unconcerned with racism. No, I think they were concerned with racism. And this critical theoretical postmodern alloy was used in that service. And when somebody like me comes along and says critical theory and postmodernism are both epistemologically bankrupt, that is viewed as an attack on the tool that they see themselves as using to attack racism. And it is viewed as me coming along and saying, your tool against racism, you can't use that anymore. And they're saying you're making us defenseless in the face of what is in many cases very real racial bigotry, and it is seen as me being on the side of the oppressor. I am seen in that way to be taking away the tools that they have to defend themselves from white supremacy. And what that means is that when you're being counter-woke, which is I'm counter to the postmodern epistemological apparatus and the critical theoretical method, because I'm against those two things, that is seen as being against the very thing that allows them to fight against racism.
This is a great place. This is a great place for me to sort of come in. So
I like you too, because I've monopolized this conversation.
My take, as I said at the very beginning, is that I sort of want to get away from all this stuff, in part because I don't mean all this stuff in the sense that I want to get away from these philosophical ideas, which I think are terrific. I want us to be able to, first of all, anchor all these conversations in very practical concerns. So let's take science. I think it's a really good example. And let's think about the sorts of things that you were talking about. So the idea, for example, we've set up this binary. And remember, what I want to do is get away from binaries. So we've set up this binary in which the woke people are saying there's no such thing as objective truth. It's all identitarian power struggles or whatever. And then there's the anti-woke, who say, well, actually, no, out there are objective truths. And even though our institutions are imperfect, we're trying to access those objective truths the best we can. And by being nihilists about it, you're ruining the possibility of any truth at all, or something like that. All right. I want to get away from those binaries. I just want to talk about concrete issues. So let's take a scientific study about a particular kind of medicine, okay? I'm going to assume, do you think that there should, and this is already a part of science, so I just want to make sure you're on board with this. You have financial conflict of interest statements. Does that seem like a good thing to have?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And now part of that is that we want to know the identity, at least the financial identity, of the people doing the study, right?
Yeah, we want to know
who's paying them.
Who's
their
funding the study?
That's right.
And is the interests of the person funding it making its way into the judgment of the people doing this study?
Why do we want to know that? Why does it matter? Why not just let scientists anonymously do studies and produce truths? Why do we need conflict of interest statements at all? Why not just get rid of them?
Because what we want to make sure that's going on when someone's doing science is that they're not laundering an idea. They're not being paid to launder an idea through an institution that's supposed to be doing science when they're actually not doing science. We don't want someone to say, I'm going to do science now about whether cigarettes are healthy, then do something that's not even approaching science.
But isn't the journal equipped to figure that out without also having to have them disclose their funding at the bottom? Why do we have to have that disclosure of funding? In other words, we already have a scientific system set up where there's peer review, there's all this stuff, but what scientists, non-postmodern truth-seeking scientists have decided is that in addition to that, at the bottom of the study, you have to disclose where your money comes from. Why? What's the suspicion? The suspicion, of course, and I'll answer the question, is that the money is going to corrupt you. And one of the things we need in addition to all of the peer review, that's right. Now, I know that you agree with me on the next thing I'm going to say to you, which is that money is not the only thing that people care about.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
In fact, there's some features of identity, religion, for example, race, all the stuff that's constantly in the media, political party, that surely affect people and bias them as much as a paycheck coming from a company, sometimes more. Sometimes people's religion matters to them more than a paycheck from a company, right?
Yeah.
So far, so good. Okay. So for me, when I think about trying to figure out what's true, let's say I'm doing a study of cigarettes, right? I am personally somewhere between the idea that there is an ideal institution called science that can dispense with the identity of scientists and simply allow science to occur in some kind of vacuum in which we don't know who's doing it, right? I think that's bullshit. And we already know that that's bullshit because at the very least, we have scientists declaring their conflict of interest at the bottom of a study. So we need to know that much about the scientist, right? On the other hand, I don't think, and again, I guess this puts me against the woke, anti-woke, but that's why I think the binary is silly. I don't think that scientific studies are incapable of discovering truths. And of course, Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, whoever these people are, I don't know who they are, obviously they think that science can figure out whether cigarettes cause lung cancer. So where we are now actually is in a really productive place of agreement, which is that we know that the identity of scientists does matter for the integrity of science as a discipline. Just stay with me here for a second. Because
I'm going to ask you to unpack something about that, but yes.
Sure. Because we know that who scientists are affects what they study. I'll give you another example. It's a really good one. When there were only men doing evolutionary biology, you know what we didn't know a lot about was the evolution of hip width in childbearing mammals. You want to know why we didn't know a lot about the evolution of hip width in childbearing mammals? Because, of course, again, any reasonable person who believes in essences knows that men are going to be more interested in studying stuff that's related to men. Women are more interested in studying stuff that's related to women. And when I did all of my research on the evolutionary biology of childbirth, you will be unsurprised to find that many of the pioneers of studying the evolutionary biology of childbirth were women, right? So does it matter for the scientific enterprise as the pursuit of truth to think at least a little bit about who's doing that pursuing? Absolutely. Now I'm going to give you another example. When I was in middle school, ages ago, I'm 40, I never learned about India, like the country, or China. I just never learned about that. It's just not something I learned about. Now, I'm willing to bet, though I'm not sure, but I'm willing to bet that the people in charge of my curriculum weren't from India or China. And if you have people from India and China weighing in on a curriculum in schools, and again, this is just sort of rudimentary, basic, if people don't agree on these sorts of intuitions, we have nowhere to go. They're going to be more likely to say, well, why not put India into the textbook? Now, I'm not saying white people are incapable of putting India into textbooks. In the same way, I'm not saying that men are incapable of studying the evolutionary biology of childbirth, or that people who are paid by cigarette companies aren't capable of doing objective science about cigarettes. What I'm saying, and again, I think we can all agree on this without bringing in any jargon, is that the identity of those people is going to have some overall systemic effect on the information we get about the cancerousness of cigarette smoke, on the whether or not India gets included in history textbooks and the extent to which it gets included, and how much evolutionary biology of childbirth gets studied. So I'm just going to stop there and see if we agree on all of this, because I'm setting a bunch of traps for you, but I want to be very explicit about it because I'm not in the business of tricking people. I'm in the business of showing that we actually agree on a lot of things that the binary makes it seem like we disagree on. So let's just start there, establish our agreement, and then I'm going to move forward to talk about the more controversial stuff about schools.
So what I think is, first off, is there's a subtle point with what you said about the identity of the scientists matters.
Yeah. And let's keep it really anchored to specific. So I want you to talk about these scientists who are doing the tobacco studies. I don't want to get into Derrida or critical theory or whatever. I just want to talk about the scientists doing the tobacco study.
Okay.
Yeah.
The liberal is going to say that things like confirmation bias are are incredibly strong. And the liberal is going to say that our interests in knowing where the conflict of interests might be is so that we can ensure that we don't fail to give, when we're putting the stuff into the academic journal and we're reading it through the academic journal, that we don't fail to make sure that we're checking for those biases. It's not that any individual person is objective, it's that once it gets into the system of peer review, that the peer-reviewed system is what can give us objective truth. Individuals, by themselves, can be so pulled by their confirmation biases that it is very difficult for any individual to give an objective. But
you mean when you say liberal? When you say liberal, again, I want to be clear to the audience because these terms get like classical liberal. That's right.
Yes.
So the person. That's right. Just to make that clear for everyone. Yeah.
So when we talk about the identity of the scientists matter, we're talking about the ways in which they can be pulled. when it comes to the postmodern theoretical person, they have a different understanding of that.
Right. I'm about to go there. So I just want to start with the scientists.
Yeah.
I'm about to move to peer review.
But, well, no, we're going to stick with the scientists for a second. What they're going to is that the scientist himself or herself has been socialized in their society, and that in a way that their social position determines what they're capable of knowing.
Yeah. Now, let me just pause you there. Because again, I'm going to keep this anchored to really real world stuff. So I'm going to talk again to the audience. You may not have heard about this, to you. There's something called the Patient-Centered Research Initiative. Okay. This is something that emerged out of medical science. And what they realized, I'm going to give a great example of this, is that physicians and scientists, because of their position in a system, had a ton of blind spots. So I'm going to give you an example of this. Okay. Just bear with me. Now, cancer researchers were trying to figure out the best kind of chemotherapy, right? And this has to do with all kinds of things. How well does it work on cancer? But also, obviously, if you're a chemo patient, how sick does it make you, right? They want to make sure that their chemotherapy works really well. So in one of the classic patient-centered research initiative study, instead of just scientists and doctors, okay, and this is very postmodern now, super scary, ultra woke, but not actually, totally normal and great. They brought in a bunch of patients, right? And they said, hey, look, maybe these patients have a perspective on how to design the study that we're missing because of who we are, okay? And the funny thing was, hold on, let me just finish.
Yeah.
One of the endpoints of the study, what they were going to keep track of, was how often did people vomit? How often does this chemotherapy make you throw up, right? And what the scientists and doctors were thinking was, hey, we really want to know how often it makes you throw up, because the less you throw up, the better, right? The less sick it makes you. To which the patient collaborative said, no, you don't get it. That's not what we care about. Doctors and scientists said, really? What do you care about? They said, we care about how nauseous we are. And sometimes we feel nauseous and we can't throw up. And sometimes throwing up makes us feel really good. It's not actually the throwing up that matters. It's the total nausea time. Okay. So again, and here's going to be a place where I think you, your audience, and me all agree. Isn't it great that they brought in those patients with this perspective on chemotherapy, so that the system itself, the study itself, the peer-reviewed study, was focusing on endpoints that were really relevant to patients? So we agree on that too, right?
I think so, but I think where we're going to have a split here is that in the critical theoretical postmodern view, this is the thing, and this is where I'm going to dig my heels in a bit, or I want to put a flag down because there's going to be a seam. There is a difference. You keep talking, all the things that you talk about identities is really just a proxy for an experience which can be empirically verified and tested. For example, the cancer patients are not having an experience or understanding because of their socially constructed identity of cancer as cancer patients. And it's not that they've been socialized by society in a way that they can see these things. It's that they have cancer and they are patients who are going through the chemotherapy. And so it is their subjective experience of objective phenomenon. That is to say, they have a first person, what is it like experience of the chemotherapy, right? That's the thing that we're focused on, not how they've been socially constructed qua cancer patients. The social construction of the cancer patient is not what's relevant there. What's relevant there in that is
sure. That's fine.
And further, once they tell us, well, what we care about is all the nausea and all the puking and everything else can be objectively verified and measured.
Okay, great. Well, then what I'm really glad to know, and this is going to be news to your audience, what I'm really glad to know is that someone who identifies as part of the anti-woke folks and a guy who identifies broadly as pretty liberal and interested in the way in which identity can shape truth, is that we actually agree that the identity of scientists and even hold on, because that's what we've agreed to now. You had some flags, and we'll return to those flags. Hold on.
Just let me think it was the identity. It wasn't there.
Hold on. Let me state.
Well,
now we've shifted to socially constructed identity. I don't know what that is, but we're going to get to that in a second. What I just want to lay out very slowly and clearly is that we agree at least that the identity, objective, whatever you want to call it, whatever technical term you have, the person, whether a patient who has experienced cancer, that's their identity. I'm a patient who has experienced cancer. It's objective identity, it's verifiable, whatever you want to call it. Or I'm a person who's been paid by the cigarette industry. That's who I am. I'm that scientist doing the study. It is important, just hold on, just bear with me. It's important to know who that scientist is. Was he or she a person who was paid by the tobacco industry? And also, and I'm just going to add one more thing, it's very concrete, because it's really easy to fly off into theory land. But what you and I both care about is making sure that kids in schools get the right education. And also what you and I both care about, I know this because you've told me this, you don't care about the oofy floofy theory stuff. What you care about is that theory in the service of making sure that we do stuff right, that we get our schools right, that we get our science right. So hold on. So it's important also that because of who scientists and doctors often are, they aren't necessarily cancer patients, that it's nice to bring in people with a different perspective on cancer to help improve the endpoints of the study. I just want to make sure we agree on that, and then I'm going to keep going.
Okay, I would say that I think that it is important to track. I think that it is multiple perspectives are important. I believe different perspectives are important. I believe that the conflict of interest piece is important, but I wouldn't say that the identity is what matters. I would say it's the perspective and the conflict of interest, because I don't think that perspective and conflict of interest are always a product of identity.
Of course not always. Not always.
And I don't
sometimes, right? Surely.
I'm not sure that's right.
By identity, I just mean, I don't want to get off into the weeds again, right? It's really hard for two people who are schooled in academic stuff to not get into the weeds. So when I say identity, all I mean is, who is the person? Where does their money come from? What race are they? Have they had cancer before? That's what I mean by identity.
Oh, if you're going to say, as long as we're willing to say it's their individual identity and not their membership of a group, yes, I can go that far with you.
Well, like they're being a cancer patient. So they're a member of the group of people who have had cancer and been treated with chemotherapy is an important thing. Or they are a member of the group of people who have been paid by tobacco. At the end of that scientific study with tobacco, again, it's not about that individual. It's about all you know at the end of the study when it says, person has been funded by blah, 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 is it tells us something about that. It doesn't tell us about the person as an individual, except as they are a member of the group of people who've been paid by tobacco companies. That's what we want to know. Is this person paid by tobacco companies or not? That's all we know with the conflict of interest.
Right.
Great.
But when let's keep going. But I want to be very clear about something, because I'm terrified of being misunderstood on this, and so this might just be a personal.
Sure. That's why I want to get away from the jargon.
Yes, I don't think that the person being a member of the group that's being paid by tobacco companies that matters. That they're being paid by tobacco companies is what they're matter. If they were the only person being paid by tobacco companies and there was no such group, and in the same way if there was a person who was a cancer patient and they were the only person who was a cancer patient, that they're the person with cancer reporting back to the doctor is what matters. Their relationship to the other cancer patients or as a group is not what is important, but that they are affiliated with the malady is what's important. Does that make sense? Okay.
I mean, honestly, it doesn't to me. I'm not quite clear on it, but it doesn't matter, because as long as we're on board with just the nitty gritty of what I'm saying, which it sounds like you are, then I can just keep going. Okay?
Yeah, maybe if I wanted to be really clear, I would say it's not the cancer patient's relationship to other cancer patients that's important.
Sure. Okay.
Okay.
Great. It's just that they were once a cancer patient, so they know what it's like to be treated with chemotherapy. Yeah. That's right.
Yes, that is
super helpful. Super helpful to have them around. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, okay. So then let's turn to these debates about CRT and wokeness and anti-wokeness and all that stuff. For me, what I really want to know, so I'm a professor in the humanities. My God, the Antichrist for most of your viewers.
Are you currently a tenured professor, or
yep, I'm a tenured professor at JMU. All views belong to me and not my university. So
JMU is James Madison University.
James Madison University. That's right.
And is it and theology, or just theology and religious studies?
So it's not theology. So the department is a philosophy and religion department. My expertise is in religion and science and classical Chinese thought, but that's neither here nor there. I'm not going to talk the Tao Te Ching or Zhuangzi right now. We're going to save that for another time. So Zhuangzi, the original postmodernist. So now I want to move to the school stuff. Okay. So one of the things that I think people do when it comes to associating woke and anti-woke, like thinking about this in terms of binaries, is what they fail to do is just think about things on an issue by issue basis. And so what I want to do, what I'm pushing for, is getting away from the woke, anti-woke stuff and just thinking about this. So we did some great stuff, right? We realized that it matters whether someone's being paid by tobacco, and it matters whether someone was a cancer patient or not. And if you keep all cancer patients out of studies, this is the premise of patient-centered research initiatives, or if you keep all women out of the study of evolutionary biology, which was the case until, I don't know, the 1960s, 50s, depends. I'm not a historian of science, so I don't know exactly, but you're going to end up with different study design. You're going to end up with lack of focus on certain features of biology, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so now we've actually already conceded. This is the great thing, is when you get rid of all those labels, what I just said is a lot of what goes under the banner of wokeness. So, for example, and this is where I'm bringing it back home. Hold on a second, because there's some stuff about what goes under the banner of wokeness that I hate. But what I want to do is get away from these banners so that we can talk about the things we agree on and disagree on. One of the things that goes under the banner of wokeness, but actually is just something that any reasonable individual would agree with, and we've already agreed on, is that who people are matters. And if no cancer patients are involved in studies, you might end up with worse study designs. Probably a good thing to bring in some cancer patients. And also, now here's where we're going to get to the real nitty gritty of wokeness, where wokeness seems to intersect with just obvious truths. It's probably a good thing when you're writing your, I don't know, world history textbook, to have people from India and China given some input on how that textbook gets written, if only for the same reasons that it's good to have COI statements on studies, and it's good to have cancer patients in there helping design the studies so that those doctors and scientists don't miss something that someone with a different perspective on the world, that of a cancer patient or that of someone more familiar with Indian philosophy or whatever, would happen to have, right? So we all agree on that. And that's great, because what that means is that actually woke and anti-woke people aren't so different after all. Now I'm going to turn from that to something that I think is bad in wokeness, okay? That's associated with wokeness.
I'm going to put a pin on what you just said, because I'd like to revisit it, but yes, keep going so that we can have some flow.
Yeah. That's exactly right. So let's talk about something that I don't like in wokeness. And this is something that I would refer to as the double bind that I think D'Angelo really emphasizes, which is this sort of argumentative tactic where if you defend yourself, you are therefore accusing yourself of the thing that you're being accused of, right? So this idea that if someone says to you, hey, I think we should have, I don't know, more Chinese philosophers in philosophy departments. And you say, I don't know, I think Chinese philosophy is kind of bad compared to Western philosophy. And they say, well, that's exactly what a white philosopher would say. So you're just exhibiting your white philosopher fragility in front of the challenge of Asian philosophy. So I just think that's bullshit. It's bullshit. And what's great is that once we get rid of woke and anti-woke, because what I think you'll find is that the vast majority of people like myself who tend progressive on a lot of issues think that kind of double bind sucks. It's bad argumentation. It freezes people. It makes it so that we can't talk about anything, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. So, and this is where I want to zoom out again to the things I said at the beginning, which is that I think the escalation of intellectual and political conflict has gotten us to a place where we can't even hash out basic areas of agreement and disagreement for fear that our agreement or disagreement will slot us into one of the camps that has become associated with these positions. And I think it's just absolutely paralyzing, because at the end of the day, what are the odds that some overarching position has gotten everything right or everything wrong? It's stupid. Of course, there's going to be problems with self-critique is a really important thing, right? And so a big step towards that is being able to say, okay, let's forget about these overarching binary categories of us and them and good and bad, and just take things issue by issue. Okay, here's an argumentative strategy, which is to confront people with their own fragility every time they disagree with something. Is that a good argumentative strategy? And the answer, my opinion, is no. That's terrible. And then we can go to something else, right? So I'll give you a different example, really concrete from my syllabus. And I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I want to make sure I seed it back to you. But I want to talk for a little bit to sort of lay out my position.
I'm
something
interested.
Something woke people. God, I hate these terms. Something woke people really like is diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, right? That's another one of those big terms. DEI, CRT. It's all these like scary letters, right? So let's forget the letters. Let's just talk about a concrete example. I'm going to talk about my syllabus because I think it's a great example. So one of the things we did as a department when we were doing diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff is we looked at our syllabi and we said, are there any ways in which we think our syllabi are like skewed in weird ways that reflect a long history of a particular kind of identity shaping what it is that gets included in syllabi? And the answer, when I looked at my syllabi, was, yeah, there was nothing from Africa, not that's a whole continent, on my syllabus. So what did I do? I now have a unit on Ethiopian Jews. Fascinating. I never knew anything about it. I have a unit on Mauritius, a country, embarrassingly, I'd never heard of, which is the only Hindu majority country in Africa. And my students are now going to get outside of Alan Levinovitz's myopic perspective, shaped by his own education and his own background, because everyone's myopic in their own ways. And you know what? They're going to get a better religion syllabus. Now, do I also think that I should tell my students that if they're white, they are necessarily white supremacists, and that my students of color have a unique insight into the nature of God because of the color of their skin? No, that's fucked up, in my opinion. Not to put too fine a point on it. But again, if we're slotting things into categories, I never get to make the distinction I just made because we're too busy worrying about whether or not we are lining up with whatever it is that one of these binaries says we should or shouldn't line up with. I'm going to stop there and just let you weigh in on what I hope are some really concrete, easy to understand examples that illustrate also my way of talking about them, because part of what I'm trying to do is model the way I'd like to see other people talking about stuff, which is to say, to get away from a lot of binaries and to just say, hey, here's this issue, here's what I think we ought to do, here's why, in sort of very concrete, anchored terms, without any concern for where that fits into these escalated, intense culture wars built around super vague, overarching labels.
Okay, so I think there's a couple of things.
Yeah.
That I would like to say in response. I'll go. How about I do it like this? I think actually there's probably a lot of agreement here.
That's great.
I have said, and one of the things that my friend James Lindsay and my friend Helen Pluckros say is that in our investigation of what gets gestured to as woke, when we were going back through it, was to unearth the critical theory and the postmodernism. So I want to say something which might get me in trouble with my own side, but then I'm gonna get back in their good graces with the thing I say after it. So
don't worry about your side, man. It's okay. Just say what you think is true. I don't care about my side. I don't have a side.
I would like to just pause for a moment and say, in every group or entity or person that's spoken to me, one of the things that I've always done is I've said exactly what I believe. And any group that's asked me to work with them or to write with them or to write for them, whether it was on a volunteer basis or whether I was working for them in the past 6 or 7 years, I've always said I will never write anything down that I don't believe.
Oh yeah, I just want to point out though that, and this is for the audience, that what you just did, where you were like, I'm going to say something that might get me in trouble with my audience, but then I'm going to say something that gets me back in their good graces. What's really terrific about that is it illustrates actually the points that I was making before, which is to say that if someone has a particular kind of audience, even if they are like you, scrupulously honest, they're still going to be thinking, as you were, about who it is that's listening to them. In other words, the position of a person, you were essentially performing what it is that we agree on, which is great, which is that the position of a person is going to be in the back of their mind, potentially, not you, because I know that you say whatever it is, but you were still thinking about it, is going to affect maybe how they say something or when they say something or how much emphasis they put on something. I just want to point that out. Now go to it. I think it's a great illustration.
I would say, yeah, and I think what you just said is something I'm just going to come back to in a second, because I think we're both touching on the same side of a thing, and we haven't come right out and said it, but we both got our hands on it. So, I have said that regardless of the worldview that I attribute to what I'll call the woke, what I'm actually going to call the critical social justice worldview, because I don't think that it's less colloquial, and it's the view that Robin DiAngelo takes for herself. It's the name she gives herself. So I'll name her on her own terms.
What do you want to call it?
I think that we're all actually in the same world. And so even if someone has what I think is a wrong worldview, they are perfectly capable of pointing out real phenomenon about the world, because they're in the world as much as I am.
Totally.
What they do with that phenomenon and how they apply it, how they talk about it, and what they think might go off the rails. So what I think that you're touching on is that the people who would call themselves anti-woke and the people who are woke are both aware, vaguely, and agree on the matter of these various social phenomenon and these various different phenomenon going on in epistemology, like if the scientist is getting $500,000 from the tobacco company that he's doing the investigation of, everyone's going to think that's suspect, whether they're woke or not.
That's right.
Okay. So there are these various. Okay. So here's where I want to get back to why I think why.
And if it's a cadre of Chinese acupuncturists producing the acupuncture study, you're going to wonder about the acupuncture study.
That's right. And so here's where I'm going to come in and angle at the postmodernism and the critical theory, and why I think those methods in particular are bad.
Okay.
In fact, when I say I'm anti-woke, that's actually a catch-all description that I use from time to time, because people have some vague description of what it means. Where if I say, well, postmodern critical theory, people kind of look at you like you just came from Mars.
Sure.
It's a descriptive. So I take issue with the postmodernism and critical theory and the worldview that undergirds a lot of this, which leads into the very thing that you talked about when you talked about the double bind that Robin DiAngelo uses.
Yeah.
I think all of that stuff, the idea that someone has a better view of God because of the color of the skin, all of that stuff flows out of, is a product of applying the postmodern critical theoretical methodologies to the problems and observations that we all agree on. If that makes any sense. So what I'm going to
can you give me an example, like a concrete example?
Let's take a concrete example. So I'll use a concrete example that will maybe throw a wrench in all of our plans, but I hope it's a good wrench. So my family is Jewish.
Yeah.
So I will sometimes have conversations with people, and they'll say, well, Mike's Jewish, so he knows that. I'm sit there and I go, I'm a Jew under halakhic law. I don't speak Hebrew. I can't read a Torah for you.
Happens in my Chinese philosophy classes. Whenever there's a Chinese kid in the class, everyone turns to them as if they have some kind of, inbuilt knowledge of what it is that Kongzi means, even if, obviously they can't speak, maybe even modern Chinese, much less classical Chinese. So yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
So that is a concrete example of what happens when the assumption is made that someone has particular knowledge based upon some ascribed social identity.
Sure. That's terrible.
Yeah. Yes.
But this is sort of like saying, but this is like pointing at, I don't know, forced conversions and saying, well, that's what happens when someone thinks that your religious orientation is what gets you into heaven. You get a bunch of people out there maniacally converting people, and that's why we shouldn't have Christianity. Of course, that's nuts.
Right.
That's crazy. Why would we do that? Why would we take the worst possible outcome of belief that one's religious identity influences their salvation and then suggest that, in fact, we should just get rid of the religion? Because in certain cases, it seems like it follows that what you should do is force people to be baptized or something. Even though that actually makes a lot of sense. Like, it's pretty clear how you would get from salvation equals Christian to forced baptisms. That's like a clear line. But it would be absurd then to just get rid of Christianity, right?
So what I would like to do here then is to say, in the same way that we're going to decouple religion from the use of power and abuse, what I want to do is I want to say that what we're doing when we are trying to figure out, when we're doing science, is I want to decouple what I'm going to call social identity, how someone is identified within their society.
Okay.
I want to decouple that from knowledge. And what I want to say is how society might view me, or my social position in society, does not constrain or determine what I know. So, for example,
I didn't quite follow that. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm going to use a concrete example, not a hash note. The fact of my being Jewish under halakhic law does not determine what I know or can't know. And I'm going to take this a step further. So what that means is, by virtue of my having been Jewish, it is not possible for someone to put limitations on what I'm capable of knowing, unless it's first-person experience. So, for example, I cannot, because I can't know what it's like to be you, for example.
Sure.
Knowing what it's like to be you is knowledge, but okay, just a technical thing there. So I can't have somebody else's first-person experiences, but you can't say that. And then the second thing that you can't do is you can't say that because I'm Jewish, that I therefore have certain forms of knowledge. Necessarily.
Okay, yeah, sure. I don't think you can say that about being Jewish, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, you have some forms of knowledge, like what it's like to be, I don't know. I mean, I don't know about your particular Jewish upbringing, but like, you know what it's like to have had Jewish parents that converted to Pentecostal Christianity, and so
sure. Right, but I can't now. Here's the next thing I want to say, and I hope you'll agree with me on this. By virtue of my social identity, I don't have knowledge about the world by view of the way society, by the view of my social position.
I'm not following the social position thing, I guess. So let me give an example so that we can really ground this, okay? So you can just say what you're saying, but use my example because I'm not quite following. So let's say you're someone with cerebral palsy, okay? You're constrained to a motorized chair, okay? And you're classified by society as handicapped. Is what you're saying, I just want to be clear because it's going to be helpful to ground this. Are you saying that person in the wheelchair with cerebral palsy has no knowledge that,
no.
Like, what are you saying about them?
That's not what I'm saying.
So use this person because it'll be helpful for me.
I'm going to contrast things. So okay. I'm going to contrast two things. So this is actually a really good example. So there is a view in disability studies which says that disability is entirely a social construct. That the only reason, for example, that we think of a blind person as being disabled is because we've constructed society for the sighted.
I'm very familiar with the debate.
Okay. My contention is that the material facts surrounding the person's cerebral palsy is what gives them knowledge. The social construction of how people think and the ideas that we have, or how that person, the social abstractions of identity, the socially abstracted identity of a person with cerebral palsy is not what gives them their knowledge.
I guess I'm just not. Again, this is why I want to get away from the jargon. So, like, just to really pin it down to this person, because it's helpful to have a person we're imagining. One thing that a person with severe cerebral palsy knows that I don't,
yes,
or is likely to know that I don't, is how people who perceive them as severely handicapped treat them.
Yes.
So they have a very relevant knowledge based on how their illness is socially constructed. In other words, how the rest of society imagines the existence of a person with cerebral palsy to be. So, for example, one thing that happens is that people will often talk very slowly, right? As if the person is very stupid. So they have a knowledge of that, of being in the world as against the social construction of being handicapped affects them, because people look at them and say, God, look at this person, right? But I'm going to talk to them slowly because they must be stupid or whatever they think, right? And that person has a knowledge of that, right? So that's, I guess I'm not following what you mean between, like, when you distinguish between like their material being a person with cerebral palsy or the social construction. There's like either way, what they know about is what it's like to be a person with cerebral palsy, whether that has to do with what it feels like to pee, or whether that has to do with having strangers talk to you slowly because they think that handicapped people are all stupider than regular people. You have knowledge of that.
So,
right?
So my contention is that the way that we'll use the term wokeness because it's the term that's available to us at the moment.
Sure.
Operates is to say that it is the standpoint epistemology is to say that the way that knowledge is, how do I put this? I want to be careful because it's such a
look, man. All I'm saying is that to protect or to defend, not defend, but like to make the case for why I'm, why the policies I tend to endorse seem to land on the left, is that all I'm saying is like, let's get this person in the motorized wheelchair with cerebral palsy on the committee for deciding how to build the fucking building so that people with cerebral palsy get into it. And also let's get that person. Let's do another thing here. I'm going to really wade into the like wokeness territory. Let's get a young adult book out there that's written by someone who has intimate knowledge either through their own cerebral palsy or having a kid who was raised with cerebral palsy or whatever it is. Let's get some books out there from those perspectives to help people try to understand a much broader set of human experiences that will then allow them to interact in ways that make the world a better place. To me, that just seems like a no-brainer. Now, does it mean that should we cancel someone who doesn't have cerebral palsy who writes a young adult book about someone with cerebral palsy? Hell no. That's one of the positions that falls under the woke umbrella that I disagree with. I don't think authors should be constrained in what they can write about necessarily, although there's some interesting caveats, by their identity. And so what we can do when we get rid of these labels is we can have this sort of discussion and actually end up agreeing that, like, a couple of books about people with cerebral palsy would be nice, and that those people are underrepresented in young adult literature world. And underrepresentation is one of those words that's like gives everyone who's watching this, possibly if they're your audience members, or hopefully because it went viral, people who just don't know what they're talking about and are trying to learn more, the underrepresentation sounds like a woke word, but actually just means like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had like a couple of young adult books about characters with cerebral palsy? It just seems to me like totally everyone can agree on that.
Right. And I'm not disagreeing with any of that.
That's awesome.
My point is I think that what I'm pushing against, and this is I think where all the stuff that you're pointing on in the dividing line between stuff from the woke that you're going, yeah, I could get along with this, and then this, I don't like this over here.
Yeah.
I don't like this double bind. I don't like this. We're going to cancel you because, if you wrote a black character and you're white, you can't do that. Okay, I won't write black characters anymore. So your books are all just white people. You're a racist because you don't include
right.
black.
I think that's terrible.
That's totally okay. So here's
like the forced baptisms.
Yes, it's all in the same.
Mercifully, you don't have to engage in forced baptisms to be a Christian.
That's yes.
Terrific.
Praise the Lord.
Praise the Lord.
What concerns me, and what I'm seeing in the movement from the critical studies area, the disciplines, critical race theory, queer theory, disability studies, is that they live in a discursive world. They have what I would refer to as a metaphysics of discourse, where everything, all of the science, everything is purely socially constructed. And all of the descriptions of the world are purely socially constructed. There is no objective core. What I'm hearing from you is you're saying to me, as I understand you, is that no, there are certainly things that are objective. How it feels
you
to
don't
throw
understand.
up your cancer patients.
I'm not doing that at all. What I'm doing is I'm saying, let's stop having weird, like those conversations are great. Subjectivity and objectivity. I love them. I did them all the time. Frankfurt, I think, was it Frankfurt who did the like, if the girl who was locked in a black and white room and then she emerges and sees the color red, did she learn something?
Jackson. That's Frank Jackson.
Frank Jackson, that's what it is. Yeah. So like, I love that sort of stuff. But what I'm saying actually is something that weirdly you seem to be agreeing with, but also performatively contradicting, which is that let's just not have that conversation. Instead, let's talk about whether we'd like to see more books with people with cerebral palsy in the young adult. What I'm saying is let's stop having the in-the-air conversations unmoored from everything else, especially when what we really care about is what we're going to teach kids in school. So let me give another example, which is tied to this critical race theory debate. Instead of talking about critical race theory, what I want to do, and I think you agree, although you seem to say that you want to do this, but then you don't do it, is that I want to get away from the infinitely discursive world. And I want to say, okay, let's look at this curriculum. Let's look at the things that people are asking for in the curriculum. Are they asking kindergartners to watch videos of George Floyd dying? Well, let's talk about that. Does that seem like a good idea? That doesn't seem like a very good idea to me, right? Or, well, what about telling kindergartners or third graders, for example, that, I don't know, in whatever historical fact is missing from a particular textbook that you think should be in there, right? Textbooks are tough to write. You have to triage what events are in there. So let's talk about, do we think we need more handicapped characters in YA lit? My answer, and this is what places me on the left, I guess, is yeah, there aren't a lot. There's only one that I know of. It's called Out of My Mind. It's a great book, right? You know what I mean? Like, I just want to keep the conversations there. And what I think you'll find is that just as Christianity becomes much less controversial, when you get Pat Robertson out of the news as the like major exponent of Christianity, right-wing watch, right? They're constantly playing these insane videos of like the most ludicrous versions of Christianity. Instead of doing that, let's just go on an issue by issue, non-discursive, highly anchored basis and talk about stuff. And I think what we'll find again is that that's when we all start to agree.
Anchored to what?
Anchored to like specific issues. So I'll give you like with the CRT stuff, right? Let's take a very specific issue. Instead of talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and instead of talking about CRT and whether we oppose those things or whether there are subjective or objective truths, right? Instead, let's have a conversation that looks something like this. Hey, is it a problem if an intro to religion syllabus never discusses any religious traditions from Africa? Is that a problem or not, right? And that's a conversation that we have as a department, or we could have as a society, right? Or is it a problem if world religions textbook, again, I'm using my own area of expertise because it's just what I'm familiar with. Is it a problem if there's only 5 religions in there? Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? Should we also try to bring in Chinese traditions like Taoism and stuff like that, or should we leave them out, right? Those kinds of conversations are terrific conversations. You know who they're not good for is the people that thrive on grievance. And the reason they're not good for those people is because those are the kinds of conversations where people can actually get along and hash out really concrete answers that they agree about stuff with. As you know from having been in philosophy classes, a surefire way to get people to disagree with each other is to say things like, does free will exist? Is there an objective truth? Are there forms, right? So when we turn conversations into impossibly contested philosophical battles and then tie those battles back to general labels, it's going to be a great way to set people against each other, but a lousy way to work together and make progress on the concrete issues like syllabus design that we all actually care about.
Okay, so here's tying your exact example. I'm going to use a different subject because I think it makes it clear. But let's tie a concrete example as to why I think you're going to have a really hard time doing that, and why I think progressives and conservatives and I think centrists can work, but I think that the woke contingent is not going is.
Yeah. Tell me an example.
Here's one.
I would love to hear it.
You say, well, we can agree on what to teach in schools, okay? So
No, I'm saying, hey, let's
have a conversation about what we need to have in schools.
That's right.
So we're going to say, I'm going to go to the math class.
Okay.
And I'm going to go to the math class and I'm going to say, we're going to teach and we're going to just lay it out: multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. And we're going to teach, 2 + 2 = 4, and 4 + 4 = 8, and 2 × 2 is 4. We're going to lay that out. We're going to lay out geometry.
Yep.
So then Rochelle Gutierrez from the University of Illinois is going to get up and say, stop. Mathematics itself contains the inherent biases of white culture. Now, most of us, I think I could get broad agreement across the political spectrum if I said, no, we should just teach basic addition, at least up until grade 3 or 4, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, multiplication, addition, subtraction, entry-level algebra, entry-level geometry, that issues of race and class should stay out of the mathematical curriculum. There's no purpose to that. That's unimportant. If we're teaching about the history of mathematics, we could include, we would, in order to avoid giving false impressions, we could include that there's a history of math in China. We could include contributions from India, from Africa, from Arabic teachers. We could do that.
Use Arabic numerals even.
For the entry level. Oh, I was here.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
You're breaking up a little, unfortunately. But I'm not sure if it's on my side or your side, but we can always edit this. Oh, you're back.
Oh, you're coming back.
Okay. So yeah. So I think this mathematics example is a really great example.
We're back. Oh,
we're back. Can you hear me?
Okay, so I've got you back. Okay,
yeah, let's talk about the math example. I'm so glad you brought this up. I just think it's such a great example.
What she says is she wants to bring forward a living mathematisch.
Okay.
And which is mathematics. The ICS drops off mathemat-EX.
I just want to know what she wants to teach me. example.
She
What does
drops
she
it
want
off, and what she says is what we want. We want to completely. She says very explicitly that she wants to get rid of the idea that we're reaching for some objective truth in mathematics. Instead, what she wants to do is question the very validity of mathematics for solving world problems because it contains within it white domination and all the rest of it. She wants to teach this in, say, K to 5.
Okay, so I mean, yeah. So this is a great example. I'm really glad you brought this. I'm not familiar with her arguments, but I'm just going to take whatever you've said to be representative of what she's saying.
Let's to be fair to her, let's say that I've oversimplified to the extreme.
That's fine. I just think it's a great example. So if what she's saying is that, and this is the theoretical thing, I guess she's saying, if what she's saying is that like quantification as an approach to figuring out what's true and solving problems has been overemphasized in part because of the dominance of an intellectual tradition that was strong in quantification that came out of Europe. I mean, I don't know, I'm not an intellectual historian. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me. A lot of people who aren't part of critical theory or wokeness or whatever have questioned the dominance of quantification as a way of establishing truths. We see it all the time. It's actually a part of science, right? So one of the things that scientists, statistical modelers are often talking about is just how much we want to look at, for example, case studies versus quantification, whatever it happens to be. So I'm going to bracket that though. That's an interesting conversation to have. What I want to know is what is she actually asking us to teach K through 5 students? Is she saying, should we stop teaching 2 + 2 = 4? If that's what she's saying, that's crazy. And I don't think you're going to find anyone, or very few people, who are going to say we should stop teaching basic addition and subtraction. Now, if what she's saying is, hey, you know what we could do in math classes? What we could do in math classes is we could say, look, just because you're really good at doing math, or just because someone shows you what looks like a mathematical proof that you're wrong, sometimes that doesn't mean that you're wrong. And sometimes people that are better at math than other people, this is actually, and I'm not talking about her, this is Paul Romer, Nobel Prize winning economist, who's talked about something he calls mathiness, which is the appearance of authority through the excessive view. If what you're going to tell K through 5 students is, hey, just because you get the math wrong, and just because someone else is better at math than you, doesn't necessarily mean that they're any better at figuring out what's going on in the world. If that's what she's saying we should teach K through 5 students, I don't know. That doesn't sound crazy to me. I mean, like, we could discuss whether or not and how you should teach that to them, but that doesn't seem like unhinged, like wild, they're coming for our kids stuff. Now, we could have a conversation about that. Maybe kindergartners aren't ready for that, but that actually seems kind of cool to me, especially for the kindergartners that are bad at math.
I wish you were saying that.
Right, but here's the thing: is if we could all,
that's the problem.
What I'm saying is that then she is the equivalent of those people who went to like military funerals holding up signs that say God hates fags. Like, let's instead, you and I, as people who have some amount of clout in the social media world, I mean, you more than I, but why not instead?
Well, you got on Rogan, so
through sheer chance. What I'd like to see more of is, hey, I totally see what you mean about like the overemphasis of math, and I can even see how that might be due to the dominance of a kind of quantitative view that came out of a particular intellectual tradition. I also think it's really great to tell kids who aren't good at math that doesn't mean that they're incapable of understanding the world, or that if someone shows them some numbers that makes it look like they're wrong, that doesn't mean that necessarily they're wrong. Like, I think then we're just off. We're now, what we've done, my opinion at least, is integrate 98% of wokeness, what goes by wokeness. We've eliminated the shitty 2%. And now we are at a point where we've revised our curriculum. We're making kids that feel bad about their math skills feel better. We're actually doing some cool intellectual history around math and exposing kids at an early age, which I'd love to do, to the kind of distinctions about, what does it mean if someone quantifies something, and does that always mean that they're right? And we're in a great place.
And I would say, I wish that was what we were doing. But what
are we?
I wish that's what we're doing. I wish that's what we, in the broad sense, were doing, right? I wish there was more of that going on. But the reason I don't think that's going to happen, or the reason that I don't think that's happening, is because when we're talking there is a how do I put this?
Let me tell you why it's not happening. It's not happening because there's a bunch of people out there who make a living on preventing precisely that kind of conversation from happening, and instead forcing people, because of political leanings or their audience or whatever it is, forcing people to kind of take an all or nothing approach to whatever it is. So the anti-woke people are like, fuck that. I don't want to teach about the history of quantification. That sounds like wokeness. You're lost, man.
I don't
And if they're not, but if they're not saying that, then we actually all agree on a ton of stuff. And there's some random lady who's trying to get clicks or trying to sell her book or whatever by taking the most extreme position on a particular issue, in which case we say, hey, I don't agree with the fringes of this position, but I like everything else. And call it a day.
And here's the thing where I think that's one of the reasons why I think that's incorrect is that part of when I talked about earlier the postmodern and critical theoretical position, when I talked earlier about that, by those methodologies being picked up, when someone picks up those methodologies, they can't rest. It is not possible in that worldview for it to stop. It just endlessly fragments and dissolves and deconstructs. That's what it does. So, for example, we talked about education. You said, well, if some random lady has got this weird thing with math, forget her. The rest of us who agree about teaching quantification can teach about quantification, and we can tell kids who aren't good at math, you're not stupid, and we can do all that.
I suspect that lady is not saying, I don't know her again. I suspect she's not saying don't teach 2 + 2 = 4.
Oh, if I was,
and if she is, but again, if she is, I don't want to make it, because I can see this is the kind of thing that people lean into.
Right.
If that's what she's saying, whatever. But like to just push back on this idea that like deconstruction ends up in this. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so if we're pushing on this, one of the things that, and this is Henry Giroux now, the critical pedagogist, saying that the explicit goal of education is to be political and to bring politics into the classroom, and he's been really, really clear about that. And he's been really, really clear about how the role of the teacher as educator is first and foremost a political role. And to me, what I'm saying is, when I'm bringing this stuff in, is that wokeness or critical theory and postmodernism together does not allow, it can't stop itself. It's an engine. Now, I will agree with you that there is a certain segment on the right as well. And I actually think that there's certain segments of the right that have picked up postmodernism. Actually, I think Trump is our first postmodernist.
Listen, I'm going to keep hammering on this. We just got to get away from these terms, which themselves have spawned. I mean, there's whole shelves of books that disagree with each other about what postmodernism is or what it entails. Yes. Philosophy is a difficult and complicated world. What's not difficult and complicated is knowing that we should teach kids 2 + 2 = 4, and also that for a long time people thought ladies didn't have the brain parts for doing the math, and that was bad. And now that we got more ladies around, we can see that that was some shit that the men cooked up because they didn't have enough ladies around to tell them to shut the fuck up. That's what we can all agree on, and then we can actually make progress together. And this goes to something, and I'm going to have to go soon, unfortunately, but perhaps if this is a popular dialogue, we can do a follow-up. That's why I'm so opposed to talking about wokeness as if it is some kind of religion with a catechism that you can get excommunicated for, because let me tell you, I agree, as everyone has seen, with many of the kinds of on-the-ground initiatives that are associated with progressivism or wokeness. I also disagree with things like the double bind, or if someone is saying that you shouldn't teach 2 + 2 = 4, I just think that's totally ridiculous, or that there's no objective truth to smoking causing cancer. I just think that's absurd. Fortunately, no one's coming for me. No one's going to excommunicate me. I am not a member of a group out of which I can be thrown, because I'm simply telling you what I think is the right way to move forward on a variety of concrete issues. I'm not declaring some kind of like allegiance to, I don't know, weird ontological categories or something like that. And to the extent that people on the left and people on the right both are doing this, I want everyone to stop. Stop doing that. Stop it. It's bad. It sets us against each other. And instead, let's focus on concrete issues. Let's ask concrete questions. Let's try to work together to solve very practical problems like what a syllabus should look like or what a textbook should look like. Or we can even, in our next dialogue perhaps, answer questions like, can education ever be not political? I think it's a really interesting question, something to talk about, but all the time being cognizant of the way the outrage machine uses tribal binaries to fuck us up and keep us from solving problems that we could actually solve if we all got together and looked at concrete issues. That's my sort of my plea to the world.
Yeah. And I think my if I had to respond to your plea to the world with my own, it would look something like this. It would say, I think that many of the things that the people who are woke are concerned about are many of the same things that those of us who are not woke are also concerned about. I think that, as Andrew Clavin has said, 80% of the people can agree on 80% of the solutions. I think there's a large overlap. I also think that method and worldview matter. And your ability to find solutions is going to be really, really, really closely wedded to your methods and your worldview. And that we need to make sure that in all that we're agreeing to as we're drilling down and going through this, that the foundations of our worldview and our methods are good, and that we don't allow our, on the one hand, our concerns for things like fairness, for things like justice, to make sure that in our self-criticism, that we don't dissolve the methodologies and worldview in the process. And what I'm seeing right now, just in general, and maybe this is part of a larger conversation, is that the way that the focus has been done, particularly in certain academic fields, is that the self-criticism is being done using a methodology and worldview that rips apart the things that could give us agreement. And so I don't want those things to be torn apart in the process. So yes,
I totally get that.
You know?
Yeah, well, so here's what we do. I mean, I know that I think I've seen you talk about this on social media too. I know you believe in a religiously pluralistic society. You've also talked about wokeness as religion. One of the terrific things, as we all know, any student of the history of philosophy knows, is that you can actually have people who agree practically, but disagree on worldviews. Actually, one of the great things about the democratic project is that we can get a bunch of people, like I know that you're not saying, because I know we agree on this, that you want to impose your worldview on other people. That would be terrible, right? Instead, what we want to do is we want to acknowledge that there are a bunch of different ways of thinking about the world. Some of them are religious, some of them aren't religious, some of them overlap between all these things. Even you said, I think earlier in the conversation, you said, hey, when me and James Lindsay were going back through this stuff, there were actually a lot of useful discoveries that we made. What I would say, instead of thinking about this as like some kind of contest between two giants where one must win or something like that, and there's the bad one that dissolves everything and the good one that has foundations, that sounds very totalizing and almost like the kind of thing that you're arguing against. And I don't think you believe that. So instead, what I think you're going to want to sign on to is what I'm saying, which is that we don't force people to adopt some kind of set of like airy-fairy philosophical positions. Instead, we just say, hey, for now, let's focus on concrete issues. What do you think we should have on this syllabus? Should we be teaching 2 + 2 = 4? And then people can use their own toolkits to come up with their own answers to these questions. And you know what? If someone's answer is we should force everyone in America to get a baptism, they can get the hell out of here. And if someone's answer is we should teach white kindergartners that they are evil sinners and that they are lesser than other people because of their inbuilt biological immorality, you say, get out of here too. And we bracket for different conversations, which are also interesting, the question of how we come to those conclusions. And we have those in a way that's, I think, cognizant of just how dangerous it can be when a simplified version of complicated philosophy ends up being manipulated in a contest for political power. Frankly.
Oh, I do. So I think that you're saying something important and good and right there. I think
that's the kind of thing I like to say.
But I also think that So if I could just step back for a moment, one of the things that I think is that you said, well, you wouldn't want to impose your worldview. Well, no, I don't. But I would also want to say, in order to do the thing that you're doing, we do have to have some agreed upon. There has to be a certain level of meta agreement. For example, that we have to agree that no one is going to be able to force all the kids to have their worldview. We're going to have to agree to do things nonviolently.
Paradox of tolerance, it implies some kinds of things. That's a much longer conversation, but it goes to a conversation I'd like to have, which is that at the end of the day, you're always going to have some kind of metaphysics and politics built into your public sphere. That's what you're saying. That's great.
I'm agreeing with you, and I guess what I'm saying is
you're agreeing with that Henry guy too, right?
Henry Giroux?
Yeah, who said politics can't get out of education. You just said that politics can't get out of.
No, I said metaphysics. I don't think.
So you think metaphysics belongs in education, but not politics. Those are separable things.
I think metaphysics is the thing. How do I put this? You have to have. There are certain metaphysical assumptions which are not inherently political, but may have effects on your politics, which.
Well, it looks like we agree on even more than I would have thought before.
Necessary. I don't think you can have a value-free education.
Of course not.
At some point, because we're picking something to teach.
That's right.
We can't, by virtue of the fact of the way that reality works, teach nothing but.
And what's so fascinating is that you actually, and your audience, whether you believe it or not, already embrace a progressive vision of it. So, for example, you probably don't think that we should only teach Christianity in religion classes, right?
No.
You think you should teach a variety of religions, right? That's the only way to come to a kind of knowledge of the world, and having that diversity of thought is good for having a better perspective on reality and understanding things, which is great.
And I'm gonna make one more here.
Who knew that you were a progressive?
Well, if you knew that I was from Canada and I worked in the Canadian government with single-payer healthcare, you might.
That explains it. It's a Canadian.
Let me say one thing else. One of the groups I write for is Counterweight, which is Helen's group, and she said, "We don't argue for no worldview. We argue for a liberal worldview."
Sure.
And the liberal worldview says that we agree with democracy, we agree with pluralism. We have a deep respect for the strength and utility of science. We believe that objectivity is possible. And we believe very strongly in individualism. And that liberalism, as we have defined it, is a sort of sparse liberalism, which is meant for conflict resolution. That is to say, when you're saying, let's deal with concrete issues, when we're getting to a point when we're dealing with concrete issue and we really can't decide what to do, liberalism guides the way towards those resolutions. And why my concern is, both on the left and I would say on the right as well, is that liberalism is being eroded by a worldview which endlessly fragments and can't do the thing that you'd like to do. And I want to move back from that, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying.
And I actually think that a lot of people, including friends of mine, can accept a certain worldview and just follow it and not realize that they're pulling themselves into something until they're already in it. I'll give you an example of that. There's a lot of people who were in QAnon who started out as thinking, well, I kind of don't trust these experts. And they didn't realize until they got all the way to the end, they go, oh, where did I just end up? Right? And we want to pull back from it. I think there's a lot of that that's happening. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the way that we've picked up, internalized, and have are viewing the world through a postmodern lens.
Let me suggest to you that the reason for the existence of QAnon or the reason. No, the reason often, not always, and not the reason, right? That's the kind of thing that I want to get away from. There's lots of reasons for stuff. One of the reasons that QAnon exists is that there was a bad actor who was extremely powerful, who decided to pour corrosive acid all over the knowledge-making institutions of the country because it served his political ends. Now, is Trump the only reason for that? No, of course not. Were there cults long before QAnon? There were. And I want to say something that's your audience is going to piss off your audience, going to piss you off, but I know that now you trust me because we're at the end of 2 hours, so I can say things that are about your family and friends. People like James Lindsay, people like Ibram Kendi, people like Robin DiAngelo, people like Donald Trump are not in. Did you lose me?
No, I'm still here.
They're not in the business of repairing epistemic frameworks and figuring out what should go on the syllabus. And I'm telling you this because it's the truth, and then I got to go, but people need to hear this. The reason things are getting progressively more extreme is because there are people whose individual positions depend on ginning up a version of the enemy in a winner-takes-all battle between ultra-simplified worldviews. That is the central problem that we're dealing with right now. And if in some small way this video can reach some people and show them that they don't have to be sucked into that vortex of binaries and us them, that they can say, you know what, I opt out. I'm going to de-escalate. I'm going to be kind as we have been to each other and respectful. I'm going to realize that when someone is shouting nonsense, they're probably in pain or confused, and I'm going to let them have their space to shout, and then I'm going to try to engage with them as a fellow human that I respect. And if they stop and don't send that tweet that feeds the fuel of the outrage machine, and instead send a tweet that feeds a vision of compromise in a time when people think it's impossible, I'll have done something good.
Okay. And I will let you go, but just to very
take the last word, please.
I do think, because I know James so well, James and I are quite close. I've known him for years.
I know. That's why I picked on him.
I think James wants to repair the epistemic frameworks. And I think, and I hope I can say this to you, I think you have underestimated, perhaps to a detrimental degree, I think you have underestimated the ardency of much of the wokeness, and I think you have underestimated the degree to which it is, because of its epistemic assumptions, utterly uncompromising.
Yeah, totally.
And so
totally
I think that James wants to repair epistemic frameworks, and I think he's written about it at length and has done so very well. Whether or not I could see, though.
You think he's trying to de-escalate? You think he's trying to de-escalate stuff? Come on.
I think James is trying to ring the alarm about the depth and the ardency. Truth be
told, I'm making a mistake, so I apologize both to the audience and to James. I actually just got hypocritically sucked into precisely the kind of thing that is so tempting that even I, as I preach from my high and mighty pulpit, ended up getting sucked into. Forget that, bracket that. Man, we had a great conversation. I love what you said about underestimating the fervor on the left, broadly speaking, and the extent to which it's associated with a kind of philosophical worldview. I think that's a really good point, and it's something that I wish maybe in the future, that point, because it's something I think I haven't dealt with well enough. I think that's a good point. It's something a lot of friends of mine have told me, and it's something I have to think about harder. I think that is a really good. That's a good way to put your position.
Yeah. Can I just say before we go that I appreciate you. There is not very many people I have met who are willing to sit for what's gone now for 2 hours and say, let's have a real conversation And let's try and do this in a way that what we're doing is not hitting hot points, but trying to find places where we can agree and try and find the structure of what it is, even if, suppose, and this is entirely possible, that everyone is flying past each other, and suppose the woke have all kinds of wonderful points about things that are getting missed, and suppose the anti-woke have this entirely great understanding of the epistemology. The fact that we're doing it the way that we're doing is creating so much smoke that nobody can see the light of it, and that it's just endlessly going on. I think that's something that is important, and that's something that I have definitely underestimated in important ways. And it's something that I need to be careful in whatever I do and whenever I'm writing. So I have nothing but respect, and I have nothing but appreciation for this conversation. And I am grateful for your time, because you don't need to do this. Your salary is paid, and there's plenty of people students that need your time, and who could knock on the door for extra credit. And that you're taking time to do this means the world to me. And my audience, such that it is, however big or small that might be, I hope that they will treat you with sufficient respect given the conversation, so that we could hear. Because whether or not they or I agree with everything you said, a lot of what you said is very important and provides an important check, so that I have something to grab onto, so I can say, is there areas in my advocacy where I have contributed rather than pulled back from the problem? So as much as I don't think we entirely agreed, I think that there's certainly points of agreement that we found, and I deeply, deeply appreciate, and I am thankful for your willingness to talk.
Yeah, it's great. I hope people get a lot out of this conversation. It was really good. I look forward to hearing feedback on it from people, and it's always good to talk things through. I think. I mean, maybe not always. That's a weird word, but I appreciate this. I hope at the very least, right. I think everyone can agree this models a form of communication that's certainly a hell of a lot better than what we usually see out there. So I really appreciate it as well. Thanks, man.
I will try to have this up within the next few days. I don't know when I'll be able to actually take the time to get down and post it, but I'll try and have it posted before next week, and we'll get it up, and we can put it out on social media and have a long, polite, careful conversation go viral, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. You know what? If a couple people hear it and get a little bit kinder, I'll be happy. So.
That's a wonderful perspective, and I appreciate you, Alan. Thank you.
Yeah, take care, man. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.